You won't believe how fast a man lost control when he tried to shame a woman into giving up her seat. But the flight attendant wasn't having it. Madeline Carter exhaled slowly, settling into her window seat, 14A, aboard the Delta Airlines flight from Dallas to Seattle. She'd paid extra for this spot, choosing it carefully. After years of air travel, she knew the value of a quiet corner, a good book, and a view of the clouds thousands of feet above ground. That window wasn't just glass, it was her escape from the chaos of the world. The cabin bustled with the usual last-minute shuffle of passengers. Overhead compartments slammed shut. Voices buzzed, flight attendants weaved through the narrow aisles, and the captain's announcements echoed faintly overhead. Madeline smiled faintly, adjusting her seatbelt, thumbing through the first pages of her novel, and slipping on her new noise-canceling headphones. She was ready to enjoy this flight, undisturbed. Or so she thought. The father and child didn't even register in her peripheral vision until they stopped right next to her row. Madeline felt a shadow loom. Then came a voice, deep, firm, entitled, slicing through her concentration like a blade. "Excuse me, I need you to move." She blinked, looking up slowly. Standing over her was a well-dressed, middle-aged man, tall, broad-shouldered, expensive watch gleaming under the cabin lights. His salt and pepper hair was perfectly combed. His leather carry-on screamed first class. Yet here he stood, towering over her with the air of a man who expected no resistance. Next to him was a little girl, no more than 6, clutching a worn stuffed rabbit to her chest. The child's wide, nervous eyes darted anywhere but at Madeline. She fidgeted with the hem of her pink sweater, clearly uncomfortable. Madeline's brows furrowed. "I'm sorry?" she asked, her voice polite but cautious. The man sighed, loud, deliberate, the kind of sigh meant to make someone feel small. "My daughter needs the window seat," he declared, motioning to the aisle seat next to Madeline. "She gets anxious during flights." His tone wasn't a request. It was an expectation, an order delivered with the assumption that she'd comply. Madeline glanced between him and the girl, heart tugging for the child but sensing the manipulation instantly. Still, she kept her tone calm. "I'm sorry. I paid for this seat." The man stiffened. "Gregory Whitman," she noted from the platinum frequent flyer tag dangling from his carry-on. His eyes flashed with disbelief, as if the very concept of being told no was foreign to him. His face hardened. He spoke slower this time, like she was dense. "She's a child." "Surely you understand," Gregory Whitman pressed, his voice low but heavy with expectation. Madeline Carter sat still, lips pursed tightly. Oh, she understood, far more than Gregory realized. She understood perfectly what was happening here. This wasn't about the little girl's fear of flying. No, this was about a grown man who strutted through life wielding his wealth like a shield. The Rolex on his wrist, the first-class leather briefcase in the overhead. Yet somehow the basic task of booking a window seat for his daughter had slipped his mind. Why? Because he assumed that when the time came, someone like her would simply fold. She understood that if she were younger or perhaps older, if her skin tone were lighter, maybe his approach would have been softer, more polite. But here they were. Still, she kept her voice steady, refusing to let the swirl of emotions bubbling inside reach the surface. "I do understand," Madeline replied evenly, "but I also paid for my seat. If it was that important, you should have planned accordingly." Gregory's lips curled into a cold, humorless smirk. "Unbelievable," he muttered, shaking his head in mock disbelief. Then, loud enough for half the cabin to hear, he declared, This right here is what's wrong with people today. No basic decency." The words hit the air like a spark in dry grass. Nearby passengers shifted uncomfortably. Some turned their heads, pretending not to listen, while others snuck glances, curiosity mixing with secondhand embarrassment. Madeline felt the heat rise up her neck. She knew exactly what Gregory was doing, performing, turning the crowd into his jury, counting on public shame to pressure her into surrender. Her stomach twisted at the manipulation, but before she could form a response, a shadow fell across the row. A flight attendant appeared, moving with purpose. A woman in her late 40s, sharp eyes scanning the scene like a seasoned referee stepping into a brewing brawl. Her navy uniform was crisp, her name tag gleaming. Helen Monroe. "Is there a problem here?" Helen's voice was calm but carried the weight of authority honed over decades in the sky. Before Madeline could open her mouth, Gregory pounced. Yes, he snapped, crossing his arms like a petulant child. This woman refuses to give up her seat for my daughter. Helen's brow lifted, waiting for the real issue to present itself. None came. Gregory sighed theatrically, sweeping a hand toward his daughter, who stood silent, rabbit clutched tightly. She gets anxious during flights, he added, his tone laced with exaggerated concern. She needs the window seat. I asked, very politely, I might add, but this young lady refuses. Madeline watched Helen closely, gauging the reaction. She'd flown enough to know. Sometimes the loudest passenger won. Sometimes staff folded under the weight of confrontation. But not Helen. Helen's gaze flicked to Madeline. You booked this seat, ma'am? I did, Madeline confirmed with a nod. Helen turned back to Gregory. Sir, she has the seat assigned to her. Gregory scoffed. I'm well aware. I'm asking you to help. Surely Delta Airlines values customer service. Helen inhaled slowly, clearly measuring her patience. Sir, customer service doesn't mean forcing another paying passenger out of a seat they reserved. Gregory's face darkened. This isn't about rules. His voice rose, making heads turn. It's about kindness, basic human decency. A grown woman refusing to help a scared child? Madeline's fists clenched, but she stayed silent. He wasn't talking to Helen now. He was talking to the crowd, spinning the narrative, trying to make her the villain. Helen, however, wasn't fazed. I understand your concern, she said firmly. If you need a window seat for your daughter, I'm happy to check if there's another available. But I will not ask another passenger to give up a seat she paid for. Gregory's jaw tightened. He turned sharply to Madeline. You really won't move for a child? He growled. Madeline met his glare, voice unwavering. I paid for this seat. I'm staying in it. Gregory barked a dry laugh and then raised his voice once more. Can you all believe this? He addressed the cabin. A full-grown woman refusing to switch seats with a 6-year-old. A few passengers shifted. One woman bit her lip, avoiding eye contact. A man 2 rows back frowned, clearly uncomfortable. No one spoke. Not yet. Gregory was fishing for allies, but the line came back empty. This is what's wrong with society, he boomed. Selfishness. No one willing to help anymore. Madeline fought the urge to bite back. She knew the trap. If she raised her voice, snapped, she'd become the angry, unreasonable woman. No, she'd hold her ground. I'm not selfish, she said, steady as stone. I paid for this seat. If it mattered that much, you should have booked one. A quiet nod came from an older man nearby. Barely noticeable, but enough. Gregory's eyes burned. You have no shame, he hissed. Helen's stance hardened. Sir, I'm going to ask you one last time. Please take your assigned seat. Gregory's nostrils flared, and for a moment, Madeline thought he might explode. But instead, he threw his hands up and hissed. You know what? Keep your seat. I wouldn't want my daughter sitting next to someone like you anyway. The words hit harder than she expected, but Madeline stayed silent, staring straight ahead. Helen, however, stiffened instantly. That's enough, Helen snapped. Sir, I suggest you take your seat now. Any further comments like that, and I'll involve the captain. Gregory's face flushed deep red, but in the end he retreated, stomping off down the aisle, dragging his daughter by the wrist. Helen exhaled slowly, turning back to Madeline. If he bothers you again, you let me know. Madeline nodded, feeling the tension slowly bleed from her body. The moment was over. For now. Helen Monroe's gaze held steady on Madeline Carter as she repeated her question. You booked this seat, ma'am? Madeline nodded once firm. Yes. Helen barely blinked before turning back to the man still looming nearby. Sir, she has the seat assigned to her. Gregory Whitman scoffed, exhaling sharply through his nose like the answer offended him. I'm aware of that, he snapped. I'm asking you to do the right thing and help us resolve this situation. Surely Delta Airlines values customer service. Helen inhaled slowly, the kind of breath someone takes when balancing professionalism with the urge to say exactly what they're thinking. Sir, she answered, patience thinning. Customer service doesn't mean forcing another passenger to move from a seat they paid for. Gregory's face flushed a deep shade of red, but he wasn't backing down. Not yet. This isn't about rules, he barked, raising his voice just enough to draw more eyes from the surrounding rows. This is about decency, about kindness, about a grown woman refusing to accommodate a child. The way he said it, loud, deliberate, painted Madeline as some heartless villain. She felt the jab, sharp as a blade. Anger rose in her throat, but she forced herself to stay silent. Gregory wanted her rattled. He wanted the crowd to judge her. Helen remained unshaken. "I understand your concerns, sir," she said coolly, unimpressed by the theatrics. "If you need a window seat for your daughter, I'll be happy to check if there are any open ones available." She paused just long enough for the words to sink in. "But I will not ask another passenger to move from their assigned seat." Gregory's jaw clenched so tightly Madeline could see the muscle twitching along his cheek. He turned his eyes back to her, narrowing them into slits. "You really won't move for a child?" he asked, his voice low, accusing. Madeline's gaze didn't waver. Her voice came out steady, calm, but every word landed like a stone. "I paid for this seat. I'm staying in it." Gregory let out a short, humorless laugh, the kind meant to sound superior but laced with frustration. He scanned the cabin, raising his voice so everyone could hear. "Can you believe this?" he called out, addressing no one in particular. "A full-grown woman, refusing to switch seats with a little girl." Murmurs rippled through the cabin. Some passengers quickly averted their eyes, eager to avoid the growing conflict. Others watched openly, curiosity mixing with discomfort. Madeline felt it, that slow, creeping wave of shame he was trying to drown her in. Not because she doubted her decision. No, but because she knew this tactic, knew the game. Gregory Whitman wasn't fighting for a seat. He was fighting for control, for dominance. This wasn't about his daughter's fear of flying. This was about her being forced to submit. Her hands tightened around the edges of her book. She felt every stare, every ounce of judgment, every unspoken question floating around her. Why not just move? Be the bigger person. And that was the part that burned. Why was it always her who had to be the bigger person? Helen must have sensed the shift in the air. She stepped closer to Madeline, her posture protective now, a subtle but clear show of support. "Sir," Helen's voice dropped, cold and firm, "I'm going to ask you one last time. Take your assigned seat." Gregory let out a sharp, angry breath. His nostrils flared like a bull ready to charge. For a heartbeat, the whole row held its breath, waiting to see what he'd do next. And then he muttered something under his breath, too low for most to hear, but the tone, the venom, was unmistakable. Madeline stiffened. Helen's eyes narrowed. "What was that, sir?" Her voice was like ice now. Gregory glanced away, jaw tight, lips pressed into a thin line. Helen didn't flinch. "Careful, sir. You're dangerously close to violating federal regulations on passenger conduct." Gregory said nothing, but the challenge was there, radiating off him like heat from asphalt in the middle of July. The cabin stayed silent. No coughs, no chatter. Just the hum of the engines and the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Finally, Helen exhaled slowly. "Sir, I'll check for available window seats one last time. But if you do not take your assigned seat after that, we'll have to involve the captain." Madeline could almost hear Gregory grinding his teeth. Still, he didn't move. Instead, he turned back to the growing audience, arms wide, voice rising again. "Y'all see this, right?" he called out. "This is what society's come to. Selfish, entitled people who can't spare a moment of kindness. What kind of person does that to a child?" Madeline stayed frozen, silent. She knew how this worked. The crowd could turn on her at any second. The wrong look, the wrong word, and suddenly she's the problem. But then a voice broke through. "She paid for her seat," a man called from 2 rows back. Steady, no nonsense. "Let it go." Gregory's head snapped around. "Excuse me?" he challenged. The man shrugged. "I said she paid. You didn't plan ahead. That's on you, buddy." A few others nodded, subtle, almost hesitant, but it was enough. Gregory's face burned crimson, but before he could snap back, Helen's radio crackled. "Any issue?" a male voice asked. Helen pressed the button. "We're good. Monitoring. Situation escalating." The threat was clear now. Gregory had pushed too far. "Sir," Helen's voice softened, but the steel remained. "Please, take your seat. for your daughter's sake." Gregory's eyes flicked to his little girl, still clutching that rabbit, wide-eyed, scared. Finally, he exhaled through gritted teeth. "Fine," he spat. "But you," he glared at Madeline, "you ought to be ashamed." Madeline didn't flinch. She just stared at him, unbroken. Gregory stomped off, dragging his daughter with him. Helen lingered a moment longer. "You good?" she asked Madeline. Madeline nodded, her voice steady. "I'm good." Madeline Carter didn't catch the full sentence Gregory Whitman had muttered under his breath, but she caught the last word clear as day. Typical. Her stomach dropped. Helen Monroe's entire posture changed in an instant. Shoulders squared, lips pressed into a thin, grim line. For a heartbeat, the entire row seemed to freeze. It was like everyone, every single passenger in earshot, heard it too, even if they couldn't admit it. Madeline's pulse pounded in her ears. She knew exactly what that word meant, dripping with implication. She'd heard it before, and so had Helen. The seasoned flight attendant straightened, her polished professionalism slipping into something sharper, colder. Her eyes locked on Gregory, unblinking. "I'd advise you to be very careful with what you're implying," Helen warned, her voice low but steely. The energy in the cabin shifted instantly. Murmurs that had been hushed now grew into whispers, spreading like wildfire. Passengers stiffened, eyes darting. Everyone could feel it, the fine line Gregory had just crossed. But before the situation could spiral further, another voice, calm, steady, cut through the tension like a knife. "She paid for her seat." The words came from the row behind them, firm and unapologetic. Madeline turned slightly, catching a glimpse of the speaker. Middle-aged, maybe mid-50s, the man wore a dark green hoodie and wire-rimmed glasses. He sat in the aisle seat, arms crossed, expression unreadable. And he wasn't even looking at Gregory. His attention was on Helen, as if silently demanding she end this now. Helen nodded slightly, just once, acknowledging the support, but her focus never left Gregory. "Sir," she said, her voice calm but carrying the weight of the entire situation, "I'm going to need you to lower your voice." Gregory exhaled sharply, like a bull ready to charge. He shook his head in disbelief, then turned his frustration outward, flinging his arms wide as he addressed the growing audience. "This is ridiculous," he barked, gesturing to the cabin. "No one here really thinks it's right. A grown woman refusing to switch seats with a 6-year-old. Some passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A few avoided eye contact altogether. Others watched, their expressions caught between intrigue and secondhand embarrassment. But none spoke. None rallied to his side. Gregory wasn't satisfied, not even close. This is exactly what's wrong with society today," he continued, his voice loud enough to carry 2 rows down. "People are so selfish, so unwilling to do one small thing to help someone else." Madeline felt a slow wave of anger rise in her chest, not because his words held any truth, they didn't, but because she could feel the unspoken pressure weighing down on her shoulders. Gregory was performing now, crafting a scene designed to paint her as the villain while he wore the mask of a concerned father. She could see it in the way some passengers flinched, the way others glanced at her, then quickly looked away, wrestling internally. Was she wrong? Should she give in? That was his game. Frame this not as entitlement, but as basic decency. Make her the bad guy. Madeline drew in a slow breath, steadying herself, and then came, unwavering as she spoke. "I'm not selfish," she said loud enough for everyone to hear. "I paid for this seat, just like everyone else here. If the window seat was that important, you should have booked it." Her words hung in the air, slicing through Gregory's carefully crafted narrative. The man in the green hoodie gave a subtle nod, quiet approval. Gregory, however, looked ready to explode. His jaw clenched so tightly it was a wonder his teeth didn't crack. "She's a child," he spat, almost seething. "I shouldn't have to plan around selfish people like you." Madeline's grip tightened on her book, but she stayed silent. There was nothing left to say. She'd made her stance clear. Helen, sensing the temperature in the cabin rising fast, stepped in again. "Sir," she said, her tone now sharp as glass, "you need to take your seat, now." Gregory's chest heaved with frustration. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. Instead, he let out a bitter laugh, and glanced toward his daughter, who stood there quietly, hugging that stuffed rabbit like it was the only safe place left. Helen's radio crackled. Another flight attendant's voice came through. "Everything all right back there?" Helen's lips thinned. "For now," she replied, still watching Gregory. Gregory let out a final humorless scoff. "You people make me sick," he muttered. But still, no one backed him up. The cabin was silent, filled with passengers who'd all seen the same thing. A man too entitled to accept no for an answer. After a tense pause, Gregory finally backed down. He reached for his daughter's hand, a little too roughly, and stormed down the aisle toward his assigned seat, 4 rows up. Helen let out a slow breath, then turned to Madeline. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice gentler now. Madeline nodded once. "I'm fine." Helen nodded, but there was something else in her eyes, a flicker of respect. "You did the right thing," she added quietly. "Don't let him get in your head." Madeline smiled faintly. "I won't." And just like that, the worst of the storm had passed. But Madeline knew better. Men like Gregory Whitman didn't give up that easily. "You should have booked it ahead of time," Madeline Carter said calmly, her voice carrying enough strength to reach beyond Gregory Whitman's smug entitlement. From the corner of her eye, she caught the man in the green hoodie nod slightly, his way of signaling approval. It wasn't loud or showy, but it was enough. Someone had her back. Gregory, however, was far from satisfied. His face darkened, the flush creeping up his neck, turning his skin an angry red. "You have no shame, do you?" he hissed, his voice low but sharp. Madeline's grip tightened around her book, her fingers pressing into the hardback cover until her knuckles turned white. Every instinct screamed at her to snap back, but she swallowed it down, determined not to give him the reaction he craved. And then, unexpectedly, a woman across the aisle spoke up. "She's right," the woman said, her voice loud enough to ripple through the cabin. "Seats aren't assigned randomly. If you wanted the window, you should have booked it." The words hit Gregory like a slap. His head whipped toward the woman, eyes narrowing, his frustration finding a new target. "She's a child," he barked, his voice cracking at the edges. "I shouldn't have to plan around selfish people like this." Madeline exhaled slowly, keeping her composure. She'd seen this play out before. The manipulation, the gaslighting, the twisting of the situation to paint her as the villain. Make it about morality, about kindness. Make her the bad guy, refusing to accommodate the good father just trying to protect his kid. But the tide was turning. Madeline could feel it. Passengers who had stayed silent were now glancing toward Gregory with expressions ranging from annoyance to outright irritation. Some shook their heads. Others whispered among themselves, eyes locked on him. And Gregory felt it too. For the first time, his confidence faltered. The flush on his face deepened, his breathing quickened, and his stance, once solid and commanding, now wavered slightly. Before he could recover, Helen Monroe stepped forward. "I need you to take your assigned seat now, sir," she said, her tone final, the kind that brooked no argument. Gregory froze. His mouth opened, but no words came out. He was losing ground, and he knew it. But surrender? That wasn't in his nature. Instead, he made one last desperate play. He turned back to Madeline, his voice lower now, laced with venom. "You know what? Keep your damn seat," he spat. "I wouldn't want my daughter sitting next to someone like you anyway." The words hit Madeline harder than she expected. A cold, sharp anger flared in her chest, and judging by Helen's immediate reaction, she wasn't the only one who felt it. Helen's posture stiffened instantly, her eyes narrowing into slits. "That's it," she snapped, her voice slicing through the cabin like a whip. "Sir, I need you to come with me." Gregory blinked, caught off guard. "What?" "You can either move to your assigned seat now, or we'll have to speak with the captain," Helen said, her tone like steel. "Your choice." A new kind of silence settled over the cabin, thick, suffocating. It was the kind of tension that only came when someone realized they'd pushed just a little too far. Gregory opened his mouth again, but this time, nothing. No threats, no snide comments, just air. For the first time since this entire mess began, he looked genuinely uncertain. But uncertainty wasn't surrender. Not yet. And Gregory Whitman didn't strike Madeline as the type of man who surrendered easily. For a moment, he just stood there, face twisted in a cocktail of indignation, disbelief, and growing fear. He hadn't expected this. Not the pushback, not the crowd shit, not the firm, unwavering wall Helen had become. His eyes darted around the cabin, searching for support, but found none. Helen didn't move. She stood her ground, arms crossed, staring him down. "Sir, this is your last chance," she warned. "Take your seat, or you and I are going to have a very different conversation with the captain." Madeline could see it. The exact second reality hit Gregory. The performance was over. The stares weren't curious anymore. They were judgmental, angry, tired of his scene. He had pushed too far. Gregory's shoulders sagged ever so slightly, the first crack in the armor. But even then, pride kept him from backing down gracefully. With a scoff, he sneered, "Unbelievable." He grabbed his daughter's hand, too rough, too fast, and turned away. "Let's go," he muttered, stomping down the aisle, dragging the poor girl behind him. Helen didn't move until he was seated, properly, begrudgingly, 4 rows up. Only then did she turn back to Madeline. "You all right?" she asked, her voice softer now, but still laced with the authority of someone who had and would shut down a bigger storm if needed. Madeline nodded, her throat dry. Yeah, I'm fine." Helen offered a small nod, her lips pressed together in a thin line. "If he bothers you again, you let me know. We're done playing games." Madeline gave a faint smile. "Thank you." Helen stood there a moment longer, as if debating whether to say more. Then, with a final glance toward Gregory's row, she turned and disappeared up the aisle. Madeline exhaled, slow, shaky, her fingers finally releasing their death grip on the book. It was over. For now. But the anger still simmered beneath the surface, not just at Gregory, but at how close it had come to working, at how easy it was for a man like him to weaponize morality, to make her the villain. And yet, she hadn't moved. She'd held her ground. Somewhere deep down, that was enough. The power Gregory Whitman thought he had, the righteous indignation, the crowd's presumed support, it was slipping through his fingers. And he knew it. "You want me to come with you?" Gregory repeated, his voice lower now, almost testing Helen Monroe's resolve, testing just how far she was willing to push this. Helen didn't blink. "Yes, sir." Madeline Carter could see it, the shift happening right there in real time. Gregory's mind racing, calculating his next move. She knew the type. Men like Gregory didn't back down, not easily. Not when they'd built their entire lives on always getting the last word. And right now, Gregory Whitman was dangerously close to making a situation bad enough to ruin his entire trip. Or worse. But pride is a stubborn thing. Instead of backing off, Gregory decided to play his last desperate card. "I just find it interesting," he sneered, raising his voice so the nearby passengers could hear every word, "that you're siding with her." His gaze swept over Helen, then landed back on Madeline with a pointed glare. "I bet if the roles were reversed, we'd be having a very different conversation." The words hung in the air like a thick fog. The atmosphere shifted, heavier, tenser, as if the cabin itself recoiled at the veiled accusation hanging beneath his words. Madeline felt her stomach twist. She knew exactly what Gregory meant, and so did everyone else within earshot. But she stayed still, frozen in her seat, jaw locked, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. Helen, though, was done playing his game. "Sir," her voice dropped, cold, sharp, and edged with steel. "I am warning you. If you do not take your seat right now, I will have to notify the captain. And if that happens—" She paused, leaning in just slightly. "I can't guarantee you'll remain on this flight." For the first time, true silence settled over the cabin. The murmurs were gone, replaced by quiet, tense breathing. Passengers leaned forward, some whispering, most just staring, waiting to see what would happen next. And Gregory finally felt it. Real consequences. Looming. His eyes darted toward the front of the plane, down the aisle, as if he could somehow measure the distance to the cockpit, weigh his options. Could he win this? Was it worth the risk? Before he could decide, something worse happened for him. Something that shifted the entire balance of power. Another figure appeared behind Helen, a man this time, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing the same crisp Navy uniform. His name tag read Marcus Lopez. "Is there an issue here?" Marcus asked, his tone polite but edged with unmistakable authority. Helen didn't break eye contact with Gregory. Not once. "We're having a situation," she answered smoothly. "I was just explaining to this passenger that if he refuses to take his assigned seat, we'll need to escalate." Marcus nodded once. He didn't need more details. His mere presence, solid, calm, and official, was enough to make the air grow heavier. This wasn't an argument anymore. It wasn't a father pleading for his child. This was now an official problem. Madeline sat frozen, watching it all unfold, a silent observer to Gregory's internal war. She could see it, the way his fists clenched and unclenched, the way his jaw twitched. Gregory Whitman was fighting every instinct he had to keep pushing. Men like him didn't back down. Not to a woman, not in front of a crowd, and certainly not when they felt entitled to win. But now he was staring down the barrel of real consequences, getting thrown off the plane, humiliated, banned. For the first time, his posture sagged, just slightly. It wasn't surrender, not quite, but it was acceptance. "Fine," Gregory muttered, his voice stripped of its earlier bravado. And just like that, the fire went out of him. Without another word, Gregory turned, his hands snatching his daughter's a little too tightly. The girl flinched, but she said nothing, just clung to her stuffed rabbit, wide-eyed and silent. The cabin stayed quiet as Gregory stomped back to his assigned seat, 4 rows up. No one spoke. No one moved. It was as if the entire plane had collectively decided to hold its breath until he was seated. Only when he dropped into his seat, arms crossed, face burning, did Helen exhale slowly. She turned back to Madeline, her expression softening. "You okay?" she asked quietly, careful not to draw more attention. Madeline nodded, though her throat felt dry. "Yeah, I'm okay." Helen gave a small nod. "Good, because you didn't do anything wrong. You remember that." Madeline managed a faint smile. "Thank you for everything." Helen's lips pressed into a thin line. "Some folks think they're above rules, above respect, but not on my flight." Madeline's heart swelled with gratitude, but also exhaustion. The entire scene had drained her. Helen gave one last glance toward Gregory's row, then exchanged a look with Marcus. "Keep an eye on him," she murmured. Marcus nodded. "Already am." And with that, Helen stepped away, moving toward the front of the plane. Marcus remained nearby, a silent, watchful shadow. Madeline slumped back into her seat, staring out the window, the clouds drifting by. It was over, at least for now. Gregory Whitman yanked his daughter's hand, a little too tightly, and stomped down the aisle toward his assigned seat. The little girl stumbled to keep up, her small frame jerking with every step. The stuffed rabbit in her arms bounced helplessly. A few passengers let out quiet sighs of relief. Others shook their heads, exchanging knowing glances, the kind that said, "We've seen that type before." Helen Monroe exhaled slowly, rolling her shoulders as she composed herself. After a pause, she turned back to Madeline Carter, her voice softer now. "I'm sorry about that." Madeline gave her a small, appreciative nod. "It's not your fault." Helen hesitated just for a moment, as if considering her next words. "If he bothers you again, you let me know. Immediately." Madeline nodded again. "I will." With that, Helen and Marcus Lopez turned, disappearing toward the front of the plane. For the first time since this entire ordeal began, Madeline felt her body relax. Just slightly. She released the white knuckle grip on her book, flexing her fingers. She was just starting to settle back in, adjusting in her seat, when a soft voice from across the aisle pulled her attention. "You handled that well," a woman said, mid-40s, hair pulled back into a simple ponytail, her eyes kind and knowing. Madeline let out a short breath, half chuckle, half sigh. "I guess," she murmured. But the woman shook her head firmly. "No, seriously, a lot of people, they'd have just moved, avoided the hassle. But you didn't." Madeline didn't answer right away. She stared down at the book in her lap because, truth be told, she had considered it. There'd been a moment, a real undeniable moment, where the pressure nearly won, where she thought about standing up, giving in, making the problem disappear just so the whispers, the stares, the judgment would stop. But she hadn't. And now it was over, or so she thought. Madeline took a slow breath, adjusting again in her seat. But no matter how she shifted, the tension in her shoulders refused to fade. Even with Gregory storming off, even with Helen making it clear she'd done nothing wrong, there was a bitter taste left behind. She glanced toward his seat, 4 rows ahead, across the aisle. Gregory sat stiff and rigid, arms crossed, jaw clenched so tightly it looked painful. His daughter sat next to him, still clutching that stuffed rabbit, her eyes downcast, too quiet for a child her age. For a brief second, Madeline felt a flicker of something. Pity, maybe. That poor girl hadn't asked for any of this. She was just a kid, dragged into her father's mess, used as a pawn in a game she didn't understand. But any sympathy Madeline might have had vanished the moment Gregory turned his head, just enough to catch her gaze. And then he sneered. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. His lips moved, forming words Madeline didn't catch. But she knew the tone, knew the look, that sharp, dismissive shake of his head, like she was beneath him, like she was the problem. Madeline clenched the armrest, turning back toward the window. No, she wasn't going to let him get to her. Not now, not after everything. She refused. But then, he did something she didn't expect. Gregory stood up. The sudden movement made the passengers in his row glance up, their expressions wary. One woman frowned, gripping her husband's arm. A man, 2 rows back, stiffened, eyes narrowing. Madeline's pulse quickened. Her gaze flicked forward. What the hell is he doing now? Gregory took a step into the aisle, slow, deliberate. His eyes locked on Madeline like she was prey. And just like that, the cabin's atmosphere changed again. The woman in the ponytail sat up straighter. The man in the green hoodie unfolded his arms. Everyone could feel it, the moment shifting. No one spoke. No one dared. Gregory stalked down the aisle, stopping just at Madeline's row. He gripped the seat back in front of her, leaning in slightly. Too close. Too personal. You must be real proud of yourself, he muttered, his voice low, cold. Making a scene. Playing the victim. Madeline didn't move, didn't flinch. She just stared forward, jaw locked. Gregory let out a bitter laugh. But we both know what this was really about, don't we? Madeline's chest tightened. She could feel every set of eyes on her, passengers holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen. Before she could respond, another voice cut through the tension, sharp, commanding. Sir, step away from the passenger. Now. Helen was back, her tone leaving no room for argument. Gregory didn't move. Sir, Marcus added, his broad frame now blocking the aisle. If you don't return to your seat immediately, we'll have no choice but to remove you from this aircraft. That word, remove, echoed through the cabin like a gunshot. Gregory's jaw clenched, his nostrils flared. For a heartbeat, Madeline swore he was going to double down, to push this until the end. But then, he saw it, the line, the point of no return, and he wasn't ready to cross it. With one last venomous glare at Madeline, Gregory hissed, You're unbelievable. Then, shoulders stiff, pride in tatters, he turned and stomped back to his seat. Marcus stood there until Gregory sat down, truly sat, before nodding once at Helen. Helen turned to Madeline. You okay? Madeline finally exhaled. Yeah, I'm okay. Helen nodded. Good, because that's the last of it. Madeline gave a tight smile. Thank you. Helen held her gaze for a second longer, then turned and walked back up the aisle, Marcus following close behind. The cabin stayed silent for a beat, and then the murmurs began. Quiet, but there. A few passengers shook their heads. Others whispered. The woman in the ponytail leaned over. You did good, she said softly. Madeline let out a long, slow breath. Thanks. She turned back to the window, staring out at the clouds beyond, her mind spinning, her body exhausted. It was finally over. Confused by the sudden movement, a flight attendant near the front immediately noticed Gregory Whitman rising from his seat. Sir, I need you to remain seated, she called, stepping forward quickly. But Gregory didn't listen. He brushed right past her, his long strides eating up the aisle, heading straight toward Madeline Carter. The shift in the cabin's energy was instantaneous. Heads turned, conversations halted. Every eye tracked Gregory's path as he marched past row after row, his face a mask of rage. Up ahead, Helen Monroe had just finished helping an elderly couple settle their bags when she caught sight of him. Her body stiffened, shoulders squaring as the situation clicked into focus. Madeline didn't move, didn't flinch, but her pulse kicked up, fast, sharp, hammering in her chest. What the hell is he doing? Gregory stopped at her row, his hand gripping the seat back in front of her so tightly his knuckles turned white. He leaned in, not enough to touch, but enough to invade her space, enough to make every passenger watching hold their breath. For a split second, it was just the two of them, locked in a silent private battle. Then Gregory spoke. "You must be real proud of yourself," he sneered, his voice low and tight. Madeline didn't blink, didn't flinch, didn't give him the satisfaction of reacting. Instead, she arched a brow. "Excuse me?" Gregory exhaled sharply, his breath reeking of rage barely held in check. "You sit here pretending to be the victim," he muttered, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear. "But we both know what's really going on here." Madeline's fingers curled into the armrest, nails biting into the padded fabric. This wasn't about the seat, it never had been. This was about control, about ego, about a man who had never, not once, been told no, and was unraveling because of it. She parted her lips, ready to respond, but before a word could leave her mouth, Helen's voice rang out, sharp as a whip. "Sir, step away from the passenger, now!" Gregory froze, just for a beat. Madeline swore he was about to push it, escalate things further. But then, Marcus Lopez appeared behind Helen, his broad shoulders filling the narrow aisle. And this time there was no polite tone. "Sir, if you don't return to your seat immediately, we'll have no choice but to remove you from the aircraft." A collective hush fell over the cabin. Madeline could feel it, the weight of every passenger's stare, the air thick with disbelief and anticipation. This was no longer a petty argument over a seat. This was a scene. Gregory's face flushed a deep crimson. For a second, his chest heaved like he was ready to explode, lips parting, shoulders rising. But then, something shifted. Maybe it was Helen's unflinching glare. Maybe it was the sheer size of Marcus blocking any possible path forward. Maybe it was the dozens of silent witnesses, waiting, daring him to try. Whatever it was, reality finally slammed into Gregory. With one last venomous glare at Madeline, he hissed, "You're unbelievable." And then, with a sharp turn of his heel, he stormed back toward his seat. Marcus didn't move until Gregory was seated, truly seated, arms crossed, face burning, staring straight ahead like a child sent to time out. Only then did Helen exhale, shoulders relaxing just enough as she turned to Madeline. "You okay?" she asked, softer now. Madeline finally released the breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "Yeah," she managed. "I'm fine," even though her hands were still shaking. Helen gave a single nod, then exchanged a look with Marcus, the kind that said, "Stay ready." And just as Marcus reached for his radio to notify the captain, Gregory made one final mistake. Gregory Whitman muttered something, not loud enough for the entire plane, not even loud enough for the passengers directly in front of him, but just loud enough for Helen Monroe and Marcus Lopez to hear, and loud enough for Madeline Carter to catch the sharp inhale Helen took. Everything stopped. Marcus's expression shifted instantly, his jaw tightening. There was no hesitation, no second guessing. He brought the radio up to his mouth. "Captain," Marcus said, voice steady but edged with steel, "we have a situation." And just like that, Gregory Whitman's flight was over before it even began. The tension in the cabin thickened, suffocating. Passengers stopped whispering. Some leaned forward in their seats, others craned their necks, eyes wide, waiting to see what would happen next. The radio crackled. "Copy that," came the captain's reply. "Hold him at the front until we can coordinate with ground staff." Madeline's heart pounded in her chest as Helen and Marcus moved swiftly toward Gregory, who sat frozen, his back rigid against the seat, eyes locked dead ahead, refusing to acknowledge the looming reality. "Sir," Marcus began, his voice calm but unyielding, "I need you to collect your belongings and step into the jet bridge." Gregory didn't move, didn't flinch. "Sir," Helen tried, softer now, giving him one last chance to cooperate. But nothing. Gregory stayed rooted, his jaw clenched so tight it looked painful. Passengers exchanged uncertain glances. A few shifted nervously. Others watched with a morbid curiosity, knowing they were witnessing the moment a man's ego finally shattered. Gregory's daughter clutched her stuffed rabbit even tighter, her small hands white-knuckled around the frayed edges. Her wide, frightened eyes darted between her father and the flight attendants, not understanding but feeling the weight of what was happening. Madeline felt something stir deep in her chest. Not pity, not sympathy, but exhaustion. All of this, over a seat. A seat. Because one man refused to hear the word no, it had escalated into this. Marcus leaned in closer, his voice low but commanding. "Mr. Whitman, if you refuse to comply, we will be forced to call airport security." That did it. Gregory sucked in a sharp, ragged breath. His hands gripped the armrest so tightly his knuckles turned bone white. And then, slowly, painfully slowly, he unbuckled his seatbelt. The sound of the click echoed through the silent cabin like a gunshot. Gregory stood, jaw tight, shoulders stiff with humiliation. His gaze never lifted, not to Marcus, not to Helen, not to anyone. "Let's go," Marcus said, stepping aside to give him the aisle. Gregory took one step forward, then hesitated. For a brief, heart-pounding second, Madeline thought he was going to turn, to say something, maybe spit one last insult her way. But then, he just shook his head, clenched his jaw tighter, and walked away. The entire cabin watched in silence as Gregory Whitman, once so sure, so entitled, was marched to the front of the plane. No one clapped. No one cheered. The weight of the moment was too heavy for that. Madeline let out a long, shaky breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Helen lingered just a second longer by her side. "If you need anything, let us know." Madeline nodded, voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you." Helen gave a tight nod, then turned, following Marcus toward the front. The second they disappeared, the murmurs began, soft at first, then growing like ripples across a still pond. "That was insane," someone whispered. "Never seen anything like it." About time, Madeline stared out the window, her body tense but her mind spinning. It was finally over. Gregory was gone, but the weight of what had just happened settled heavy in her chest. It wasn't just about the seat. It was never just about the seat. It was about power, ego, entitlement, and the sickening fact that if she had given in, if she'd just moved, that man would have walked away feeling justified, ready to do it again to the next woman who dared say no. Instead, he walked off that plane in shame. Madeline blinked, her gaze shifting toward the clouds outside. She didn't feel victorious, she felt tired. But deep down, she knew she'd done the right thing. Sometimes standing your ground wasn't about winning. It was about refusing to shrink. Refusing to be small because someone expected you to be. The woman in the ponytail leaned across the aisle once more. "You really did good," she whispered, her voice kind, sincere. Madeline smiled faintly. "Thanks." The engines roared to life, the plane ready to finally take off. And for the first time in what felt like hours, Madeline allowed herself to relax. She leaned back, closed her eyes, and breathed. It was over. The cabin buzzed with hushed voices as passengers whispered to one another. Some shook their heads, casting glances toward where Gregory Whitman had been sitting moments before. Others muttered quietly, their words lost beneath the low hum of the plane. Though Madeline Carter caught the tone, a mixture of disbelief and satisfaction. Then a voice from across the aisle broke through. "About time," the woman in the ponytail muttered, shaking her head as she leaned back in her seat. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried enough to be heard by those around her. A man in the row behind her let out a low chuckle. "He had that coming," he muttered, earning a few nods from nearby passengers. But Madeline didn't react. She didn't turn, didn't acknowledge the comments, the looks, or the collective sense of relief spreading through the cabin. Instead, she turned back toward the window, staring out into the endless blue sky beyond. She let the moment sink in. She wasn't proud of what happened. She wasn't happy about it either. What she felt was exhaustion. A deep, bone-tired weariness that settled heavy on her shoulders. Because she knew, deep down, that this could have ended very differently. If she had raised her voice, if she had snapped, thrown his words back in his face, or lost her temper even for a second, the story wouldn't be about Gregory Whitman. the entitled man who tried to bully a woman out of her seat? No. It would have been about her, the angry woman, the problem passenger, the one who caused a scene. And that was the part that stung the most, because it was always people like her expected to be the bigger person, to stay quiet, to endure. But she hadn't. Despite the stress, the confrontation, the humiliation Gregory tried so hard to heap on her, Madeline held her ground. She stayed seated, both literally and figuratively, and she didn't regret a thing. Because in the end, she hadn't moved. And sometimes that's enough. This story was never just about a man losing his temper over a seat. No, it was about power, about entitlement, about how some people will do absolutely anything to avoid hearing the word no. It was about a man like Gregory Whitman, used to getting his way, used to people folding, backing down, and making themselves small so he could feel big. And it was about a woman like Madeline, forced to choose between standing up for herself or enduring the weight of someone else's expectations. Because for people like her, sometimes simply saying no, holding firm, refusing to shrink under pressure, it becomes an act of defiance. But it shouldn't be. Respect isn't optional. It isn't negotiable. It isn't something to be handed out based on who shouts the loudest or who wears the most expensive watch. Respect is earned, and it's owed, no matter who you are. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is stay exactly where you are. Madeline let out a slow breath, her gaze still locked on the clouds outside. The tension in her body eased, just a little. She wasn't looking for praise. She wasn't looking for validation. But in that moment, she knew, without question, that she did the right thing. And maybe, just maybe, someone else on that plane watched it all unfold and realized that they too didn't have to give in next time. Maybe that was enough. If you've ever had an experience like this, where someone tried to shame you into submission, where you were forced to choose between what was right and what was easy, I want to hear about it. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want more stories like this, stories about standing your ground, about people refusing to back down, make sure to subscribe. Because trust me, there's always more to talk about. At the end of the day, this story wasn't just about a man demanding a seat or a woman refusing to move. It was about something much deeper. It was about power, ego, and how some people feel entitled to control every situation around them simply because they're used to getting their way. Gregory Whitman believed that money, status, and a loud voice were enough to bend the world to his will. But what he didn't count on was someone like Madeline Carter, someone who understood that standing her ground didn't make her selfish, it made her strong. And that's the lesson here. Your boundaries matter. No one, no matter how important they think they are, has the right to bully you, shame you, or manipulate you into giving up something you worked hard for, whether it's your seat, your dignity, or your peace of mind. People like Gregory will always try to twist the situation, play the victim, and weaponize guilt to get what they want. But standing firm, staying calm, and refusing to fold, that's power, real power. What stood out most in this story is how quickly the narrative could have changed if Madeline had raised her voice or reacted emotionally. So many times people, especially women, are forced into uncomfortable situations and made to feel like being kind means sacrificing yourself. But it's not true. There's a difference between kindness and submission. Respect is not something you should ever have to bargain for. You deserve it, period. And sometimes the strongest thing you can do is stay seated, literally and figuratively, just like Madeline did. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been in a similar situation or witnessed one, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever had to stand your ground when someone tried to push you past your limits? Share your experience in the comments below, because these conversations matter. They remind us we're not alone when faced with these moments. And if you enjoyed this story or learned something valuable from it, please don't forget to hit that like button. It helps more people see this content. Share this video with someone who needs the reminder that it's okay to say no, that it's okay to stand their ground. Subscribe to the channel for more stories just like this. Stories about people standing up, refusing to be walked over, and reclaiming their power one moment at a time. Trust me, there's always more to talk about, and you won't want to miss what's coming next.